The vultures were already circling when I found him. Samuel Hartwell was crawling through the Nevada sand on his belly, leaving a crimson trail behind him like some wounded animal marking its death march. The same man who had branded the letter H into my left shoulder blade when I was 14 years old was now clawing at rocks and desert brush, gasping my name between cracked, bleeding lips. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Joshua Blackwood. I sat on my horse, perfectly still, watching the man who had destroyed my childhood beg the desert for mercy. 3 days earlier, I had been riding toward Oregon Territory, finally free after 28 years of bondage. The 13th Amendment had been ratified 6 months ago, and I carried my freedom papers in my saddlebag like a talisman against the past. But freedom, I was learning, tasted different when you had nowhere to call home and no family waiting for your arrival. The morning had started like any other on the trail. I'd watered my horse at a small creek, eaten the last of my hardtack, and continued northwest through the endless expanse of sagebrush and alkali dust. That's when I'd seen the smoke rising from Dead Man's Canyon, thin and desperate against the cloudless sky. My first instinct was to ride wide around whatever trouble lay ahead. 28 years of slavery had taught me that curiosity was a luxury I couldn't afford, but something about that smoke nagged at me. It wasn't the thick black column of a campfire or the gray billow of burning wagon canvas. This was the patchy, irregular smoke of someone trying to signal for help with whatever they could find to burn. Someone dying alone in the desert. Should have kept riding. Instead, I dismounted and crept to the canyon's edge, expecting to find Apache raiders or maybe a broken wagon wheel and dead oxen. What I found was Samuel Hartwell, former colonel in the Confederate Army, former owner of Hartwell Plantation in Mississippi, and the man who had made my life a living hell for more than 2 decades. He was alone, which surprised me. Hartwell had always surrounded himself with loyal men, other planters and overseers who shared his belief that black folks were property to be bought, sold, and worked until we dropped. But here he was, miles from any settlement, his expensive clothes torn to shreds, his gray hair matted with blood and sand. A broken rifle lay beside him, its stock splintered. Scattered around his position were the remains of what had once been a small camp, torn canvas, scattered supplies, and the picked clean bones of what might have been a horse. Judging by the tracks in the sand, Shoshone raiders had hit him hard too, maybe 3 days ago. They'd taken everything worth taking and left him for dead. They'd made one mistake though. Samuel Hartwell was too stubborn to die easy. Water ... He croaked, his voice barely audible over the desert wind. Please ... I know you're there ... I stayed hidden behind a boulder, studying the man who had haunted my nightmares for years. Hartwell had always been a big man, broad-shouldered and intimidating, with cold blue eyes that could freeze your blood. Now he looked shrunken, diminished by pain and dehydration. His face was burnt raw by the sun, and his lips were split and bleeding. The mighty colonel who used to stride across his plantation, like he owned the very ground beneath his feet, was now reduced to this, a broken man begging the desert for one more day of life. Part of me wanted to watch him die. The rational part. The part that remembered every whipping, every degradation, every moment of soul-crushing hopelessness I'd endured under his rule. This was justice, wasn't it? Divine retribution for a man who had treated human beings like livestock. But I couldn't stop staring at his hands. They were scraped raw from crawling across the rocks, fingernails torn and bloody from clawing at the unforgiving ground. These were the same hands that had signed the bill of sale when my mother was sold to a cotton plantation in Alabama. The same hands that had counted out 30 pieces of silver when my sister Rebecca was sold to a sugar mill in Louisiana. The Kampu. Same hands that had held the branding iron that marked me as his property, Now those hands were shaking with fever and exhaustion, grasping at empty air like a drowning man reaching for a rope that wasn't there. "I can see your shadow," Hartwell whispered, his eyes finding mine across the 20 yards of desert between us. "I know it's you, Joshua. I'd recognize that stubborn posture anywhere." The sound of my name on his lips sent a chill down my spine. For 28 years, he'd never called me anything but boy, or you there, or simply pointed when he wanted my attention. Hearing him use my actual name felt wrong, like a violation of some natural order. I stepped out from behind the boulder, my hand resting on the Colt revolver I'd taken from a Confederate deserter outside Vicksburg. The weight of the weapon felt reassuring against my palm, a reminder that I was no longer the helpless boy who had trembled at the sound of Hartwell's voice. "Colonel," I said, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest. He tried to push himself up on his elbows, but collapsed back down with a groan. Blood was seeping through his shirt from what looked like arrow wounds in his shoulder and thigh. The Shoshone had marked him well before leaving him to the deserts. "Mercy, you're a long way from Mississippi," I observed, walking slowly toward him. Each step felt surreal, like I was moving through a dream where the natural order of things had been turned upside down. "So are you," he replied, his eyes never leaving mine. "Heard you were dead. Killed trying to escape 3 years back. Disappointed?" A ghost of a smile crossed his cracked lips. "Relieved, if I'm being honest. Always knew you were too smart for your own good. Figured you'd find a way to get yourself free eventually." The admission caught me off guard. In all my years under his rule, Hartwell had never acknowledged my intelligence, never admitted that I was anything more than a beast of burden with an unfortunate tendency toward independent thought. "What are you doing out here?" I asked, crouching down just beyond his reach. Old habits died hard, and some part of me still expects him to lash out, to try to grab me and drag me back into chains. "Mining," he said, then coughed up blood. "Silver strike in the Ruby Mountains. Thought I could start over, build something new after the war. Didn't work out. Turns out being good at owning slaves doesn't make you good at much else." His voice was bitter, filled with a self-loathing I'd never heard before. Lost everything I invested. Was heading back east when the Shoshone found my camp. I studied his wounds more carefully. The arrow in his shoulder had gone clean through, but the one in his thigh was still lodged deep, the shaft broken off close to the skin. Dark blood had soaked through his pants and was starting to attract flies. Without medical attention, he'd be dead by sunset. "How long since you've had water?" I asked. 2 days. "Maybe 3. Time gets funny when you're dying." I looked around at the barren landscape stretching in every direction. We were at least 40 miles from the nearest settlement, maybe more. Even with a horse, it would take me the better part of 2 days to reach help. And that was assuming I could find the way without getting lost myself. "Why should I help you?" The question came out harsher than I'd intended, but I couldn't take it back. Hartwell closed his eyes and was quiet for so long, I thought he might have passed out. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Because I have something you need to know. Something about your sister Rebecca." The world seemed to stop spinning. Rebecca had been sold when she was 16, torn away from our family in the middle of the night while I was working in the fields. I'd tried to find out where she'd been taken, but Hartwell had forbidden anyone from speaking about it. For 12 years, I'd assumed she was dead, worked to death in some sugar plantation hellhole. "Rebecca's been dead for years," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "No," Hartwell said, opening his eyes and staring directly into mine. "She's not." The simple words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my legs go weak and had to steady myself with one hand on the ground. After all these years of grieving, all these years of carrying the guilt that I hadn't been able to protect her, he was telling me she was alive? "You're lying. I wish I was." He coughed again, bringing up more blood. "But if you want to know where she is, If you want to know what really happened to her, you're going to have to keep me alive long enough to tell you." I stared at this broken man who had controlled every aspect of my life for so long, trying to read the truth in his pain-filled eyes. Was this just another manipulation, one final attempt to exert power over me, even as he lay dying? Or was he really holding information that could reunite me with the sister I'd mourned for 12 years? The desert wind picked up, sending dust devils dancing across the sand. In the distance, I could hear the lonely cry of a hawk circling overhead, waiting for death to claim another victim. The sun was already past its zenith, and the temperature would drop rapidly once night fell. If I was going to make a decision, it had to be now. I pulled the water bottle from my saddle and knelt beside Hartwell. His eyes widened in surprise as I lifted his head and held the bottle to his lips, letting him drink slowly so he wouldn't choke. "This doesn't make us even," I said as he drank. "I know. And it doesn't mean I forgive you. I know that too." I pulled the bottle away after he'd had enough to wet his throat. "But if you're lying about Rebecca, if this is some kind of game, I'll leave you here to rot. Understood?" Hartwell nodded weakly. Understood. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I looked at the arrow shaft protruding from his thigh and the spreading stain of blood around it. Removing it would be dangerous. I could hit an artery and kill him in minutes. But leaving it would mean slow death from infection and blood loss. "This is going to hurt," I warned, grasping the broken shaft. "Everything hurts," he replied. "Do what you have to do." I took a deep breath and pushed the arrow the rest of the way through his leg, bringing a scream from his throat that echoed off the canyon walls. But the bleeding wasn't as bad as I'd feared, and I quickly packed the wound with strips torn from his shirt. "Talk," I said as I worked. "Tell me about Rebecca." "Not here," he gasped, sweat beading on his forehead despite the desert heat. "Too exposed. Shoshone might come back to check their work." He was right. We needed shelter, and we needed it before nightfall. I looked around the canyon, searching for anywhere that might provide protection from both the elements and any war parties that might be in the area. "There," Hartwell said, pointing with a shaking hand toward a cluster of rocks about 200 yards away. "Saw it when they hit me. Cave entrance behind those boulders." I helped him to his feet, surprised by how light he felt. The man who had once seemed larger than life was now just skin and bones, hollowed out by pain and the unforgiving desert. He leaned heavily on my shoulder as we made our way slowly across the sand, each step a monumental effort for both of us. Cave was exactly where he'd said it would be, hidden behind a natural wall of weathered stone. It wasn't large, but it was deep enough to provide shelter and concealment from anyone passing through the canyon. More importantly, there was a small seep in the back wall where water had collected in a natural basin. I helped Hartwell settle against the cave wall and gave him another small drink from my water bottle. His color was slightly better, but I could see the fever building in his eyes. Infection was setting in, and without proper medicine, he wouldn't last more than a few days. "Now," I said, settling across from him in the gathering dusk, "tell me about my sister." Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the desert beyond the cave entrance. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with something I'd never heard from him before, genuine remorse. "I didn't sell Rebecca to a sugar plantation," he began. "I sold her to a man named Thomas Brennan in California. Rich man owned a ranch near Sacramento. He was looking for household help, and he was willing to pay premium prices for women who looked like Rebecca." The implication hit me like a punch to the gut. Rebecca had been beautiful, even as a teenager. Light-skinned, with our mother's green eyes and delicate features. The kind of woman who would attract the attention of men with money and power. What did he do to her? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Nothing at first. Brennan's wife was still alive then, kept him in line. Rebecca worked in the house, learned to read and write. Mrs. Brennan even taught her French and piano. For a few years, it was almost like she was free. Almost. When Mrs. Brennan died, things changed. Brennan started paying attention to Rebecca. She fought him off at first, but Hartwell's voice trailed off, and I saw tears forming in his eyes. In all my years of knowing him, I had never seen Samuel Hartwell cry. "She had his children," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. He nodded. 3 of them. 2 boys. And a girl. Brennan never acknowledged them officially, but he didn't sell them either. Kept them all on the ranch. Treated Rebecca more like a wife than a slave. The cave fell silent, except for the distant sound of wind through the rocks. I tried to process what he was telling me, tried to imagine my sister living this strange half-life of slavery and privilege, bearing children to the man who owned her. "Is she still there?" I asked finally. "I don't know." Hartwell coughed, bringing up more blood. "Last I heard was 2 years ago. Brennan had died, left the ranch to his legitimate son from his first marriage. The son was planning to sell the place, move back east. What about Rebecca and her children? Free, legally. The Emancipation Proclamation reached California. But, where would they go? What would they do?" Hartwell nodded. "Rebecca spent 20 years on that ranch. It's the only home her children have ever known. If the new owner sold the place, the implications were clear. My sister and her children would be adrift in a world that didn't want them, carrying the burden of their mixed heritage in a society that saw them as neither black nor white, but something in between that threatened everyone." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Why now?" Hartwell looked directly at me, and in his eyes I saw something I'd never expected to find there. Guilt so deep it had carved lines in his face and bent his shoulders with its weight. "Because I've been carrying this knowledge for 12 years. Joshua, 12 years of knowing I tore your family apart and set your sister into a life that was better than some slaves had, but worse than any human being deserves. And because—" He paused, struggling with words that seemed too heavy for his failing voice. "Because I'm dying, and I can't take this to my grave without giving you the chance to find her." The sun had set while we talked, and the cave was now filled with the deep blue darkness of the desert night. Outside, I could hear the first tentative calls of coyotes beginning their evening hunt. The temperature was already dropping, and I knew it would be bitter cold before morning. I had decisions to make. Keep Hartwell alive long enough to get more information about Rebecca's location, or let him die and try to find her on my own with the few clues he'd already given me. Risk my own life trying to save the man who had destroyed my childhood, or let justice take its natural course in this unforgiving wilderness. But as I looked at Samuel Hartwell, broken and dying in the darkness of the cave, I realized something had changed. The man I'd hated for so long was no longer the all-powerful monster of my memories. He was just a human being, flawed and failed, carrying his own burden of guilt and regret, and he held the key to finding the sister I'd thought was lost forever. The choice, when it came down to it, wasn't really a choice at all. The first time I saw Samuel Hartwell, I was 7 years old, and he was buying me a piece of furniture. Had been sleeping on a pile of rags in the corner of Widow Morrison's kitchen when the sound of horses woke me. Through the cracked window, I watched a tall man in expensive coat dismount from a bay stallion, his boots clicking against the wooden porch with the confidence of someone who owned everything he touched. Even at 7, I knew the sound of money and power. That him? Hartwell's voice carried through the thin walls as clearly as if he'd been standing beside me. "That's the boy," Widow Morrison replied, her voice trembling slightly. She was in debt, I learned later. Her late husband had mortgaged the small farm to buy slaves he couldn't afford, and now she was selling us off one by one to keep from losing everything. Smart as a whip, that one. Already knows his letters and numbers. I don't need him to be smart. I need him to be strong. He'll grow into it, Colonel. Good bloodlines. His daddy was built like an ox before the fever took him. I pressed my face against the glass, watching this stranger decide my fate with the casual indifference of a man selecting livestock. Hartwell was perhaps 40 then, clean-shaven and broad-shouldered, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to take inventory of everything they touched. He carried himself like a soldier, which I later learned he was, West Point graduate, veteran of the Mexican War, and heir to one of the largest cotton plantations in Mississippi. "What about the girl?" he asked, and my heart lurched as I realized he was talking about Rebecca. My sister was 12 then, already showing signs of the beauty that would make her so valuable to men like Hartwell. She'd been working in the Morrison house for 2 years, learning to cook and clean and carry herself with the quiet dignity our mother had taught us before consumption took her. "She's not for sale," Widow Morrison said quickly. "My late husband, he was particular about that girl, made me promise to keep her close." Even through the window, I could see Hartwell's expression change. His eyes narrowed slightly, and a cold smile played at the corners of his mouth. It was the look of a man who wasn't used to being told no. "Everything's for sale, Mrs. Morrison. It's just a matter of price. Not her. I gave my word." Hartwell reached into his coat and pulled out a leather wallet thick with bills. $500 for the boy, $1,000 for both. I watched Widow Morrison's face crumble as she stared at more money than she'd probably seen in her entire life. The farm was worth maybe $200 on a good day, and here was this stranger offering 5 times that for 2 children she'd inherited along with her dead husband's debts. I can single quotes Mrs. Morrison. Hartwell's voice became gentle, almost paternal. "Your husband owed money to some very unforgiving people. People who won't hesitate to take this farm and everything on it, including those children. At least this way they'll have a roof over their heads and food in their bellies." It was masterfully done. He'd researched her situation, understood her desperation, and presented the sale not as greed, but as mercy. The fact that he was condemning 2 children to a lifetime of bondage was irrelevant to him. We were property, nothing more. "The boy and girl go together," Widow Morrison said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "They're all the family either. One has left, of course." Hartwell counted out the bills with mechanical precision. "I'm not in the business of separating families unnecessarily." That was the first lie he told about us. But it wouldn't be the last. The journey to Hartwell Plantation took 3 weeks through the Mississippi wilderness. Rebecca and I rode in the back of a supply wagon, chained at the ankles like criminals, while Hartwell and his overseer, a brutal man named Pike Crawford, rode alongside on horseback. We weren't allowed to speak during the day, and at night we were shackled to the wagon wheels to prevent escape. It was during that journey that I began to understand the kind of man Samuel Hartwell really was. He was educated, well-read, and could discuss philosophy and literature with the casual authority of someone who'd spent years in the finest schools. He treated his horse better than most men treated their wives, ensuring it was properly fed, watered, and rested at every stop. He even carried a leather-bound book of poetry that he read aloud to Crawford during their evening meals, his cultured voice reciting verses about love and honor and the nobility of the human spirit. But when it came to us, he was something else entirely. On the 5th night of the journey, Rebecca developed a fever. She was burning up, delirious and shaking uncontrollably despite the warm summer air. I begged Crawford to let me tend to her, to at least give her some water to bring down the fever. "Slaves don't make demands," Crawford snarled, striking me across the face with the back of his hand. "You speak when spoken to, boy." I looked toward Hartwell, hoping for some shred of human decency. He was sitting by the campfire, calmly eating his dinner while my sister suffered 10 feet away. "Colonel," I said, my voice cracking with desperation, "please, she's sick. She needs help." Hartwell looked up from his plate with mild annoyance, as if I'd interrupted him during an important conversation. "Mr. Crawford is right, Joshua. You need to learn your place. But she's just a child. She's property." His voice was calm, matter of fact. "Valuable property, I'll grant you, but property nonetheless. And property doesn't get special treatment just because it's temporarily malfunctioning." That was the moment I truly understood what we were to him. Not children, not human beings, with thoughts and feelings and fears, but things. Investments to be managed and maintained for maximum profit. Rebecca recovered from the fever, but the incident taught me something crucial about survival under Samuel Hartwell's rule. Emotion was a luxury I couldn't afford. Showing fear, anger, or desperation would only make him enjoy his power more. The only way to protect myself and my sister was to become what he wanted, a perfect slave who never questioned, never resisted, never showed any sign of independence. Thought it was a lesson that would serve me well over the next 28 years. Hartwell Plantation was a monument to human suffering disguised as Southern hospitality. The main house was a grand affair, 3 stories of white columns and wraparound, porches that spoke of wealth and refinement. Gardens filled with magnolias and azaleas created an atmosphere of genteel beauty that visiting dignitaries would remember fondly for years to come. But behind the big house, hidden from the view of polite society, was where the real business of the plantation took place. The slave quarters were a collection of one-room shacks built from rough timber and chinked with mud. 50 families crammed into structures barely fit for livestock, sleeping on dirt floors and eating whatever scraps the kitchen could spare. Rebecca was assigned to housework almost immediately. Her light skin and delicate features made her suitable for service in the main house, where appearance mattered as much as competence. She learned to set proper tables, arrange flowers, and move through the rooms like a ghost, present when needed, invisible when not. I was sent to the fields. At 7 years old, I was too small for the heavy work of cotton picking, so I started with simpler tasks. Carrying water to the field hands, clearing rocks from freshly plowed earth, feeding the livestock. But Hartwell had plans for me, plans that became clear as I grew older and stronger. "That boy's got potential," I heard him tell Crawford one evening as they stood on the porch overlooking the fields. "Smart, observant, learns fast. Could be useful as a driver someday, maybe even an overseer if we handle him right." The idea of making me complicit in the oppression of my own people was typical of Hartwell's calculating mind. He understood that the most effective way to control slaves wasn't through constant brutality, though he was certainly capable of that when necessary, but through careful manipulation of loyalty and self-interest. He began giving me small privileges: better food, warmer clothes, permission to visit Rebecca in the big house occasionally. He even taught me to read and write, claiming it would make me more valuable as a plantation manager. What he was really doing was creating a psychological trap, making me dependent on his approval and terrified of losing the small comforts he'd granted me. For years, the strategy worked. I became Hartwell's favorite, the slave he pointed to when visitors asked about the intelligence and potential of his workers. I learned to anticipate his needs, to read his moods, to present myself as the grateful recipient of his benevolence. I played the part so well that even some of the other slaves began to resent me, seeing me as Hartwell's pet rather than one of their own. But beneath the surface, I was planning. Every kindness Hartwell showed me, I filed away as information about his character. Every conversation I overheard in the big house, I memorized for future use. Every map or document I glimpsed while cleaning his study, I committed to memory. I was building an escape plan that would take years to execute, but I was patient. Patience was one thing slavery had taught me well. The plan might have worked too, if not for what happened when Rebecca turned 16. I should have seen it coming. Rebecca had grown from a pretty child into a beautiful young woman, with our mother's green eyes and a grace that turned heads wherever she went. In the big house, she moved like poetry, serving dinner parties and tending to guests with a quiet dignity that impressed even the most hardened plantation wives. But beauty was dangerous for a slave woman, especially one as striking as Rebecca. It attracted attention from men who saw her not as a person, but as an object to be possessed. The first sign of trouble came during the Maizand Christmas social of 1847. Hartwell was entertaining a group of neighboring planters and their families, showing off his hospitality and the efficiency of his operation. Rebecca was serving in the dining room, moving gracefully between the tables with platters of food and crystal glasses of wine. I was working in the kitchen, helping prepare the endless stream of dishes required for such occasions. Through the serving window, I could see into the dining room where the white folks were eating and drinking and congratulating themselves on their prosperity. That's when I noticed James Whitmore. Whitmore was the son of a plantation owner from the next county, a young man in his 20s with a reputation for drinking, gambling, and taking liberties with slave women. He'd been watching Rebecca all evening, his eyes following her movements with predatory interest. When she bent to refill his wine glass, I saw him place his hand on her arm, holding her in place while he whispered something in her ear. Rebecca's face went pale, but she couldn't pull away without causing a scene that would have consequences for both of us. "Beautiful girl," Whitmore said loudly enough for the other guests to hear. "Hartwell, you've got excellent taste in house slaves." "Rebecca's been with us for 9 years," Hartwell replied with obvious pride. "Well-trained, intelligent, knows her place. I've had offers for her, but I prefer to keep my best people close." The conversation that followed still haunts me. These educated, refined men and women discussed my sister like she was a prized horse, commenting on her bloodlines, her potential for breeding, her market value. They spoke of her reproductive capacity with the same casual interest they might show for the yield potential of a new cotton strain. And through it all, Rebecca stood perfectly still, her face a mask of composure while inside she must have been screaming. That night, after the guests had retired to their rooms, I found Rebecca in the kitchen washing dishes with hands that shook so badly she could barely hold the china. "What did he say to you?" I asked. She was quiet for a long moment, focusing intently on scrubbing a plate that was already clean. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but I could hear the fear underneath. "He asked Colonel Hartwell if I was for sale. Said he'd pay a premium price for breeding stock like me." The words hit me like a physical blow. What did the colonel say? That I wasn't available? That he had other plans for me? We both understood what that meant. Hartwell had been patient, watching Rebecca grow from a child into a woman, waiting for the right moment to claim what he considered his right of ownership. The only reason he'd refused Whitmore's offer was because he wanted Rebecca for himself. That night, as I lay on my pallet in the slave quarters, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to get Rebecca out of there, whatever the cost. The careful escape plan I'd been developing for years would have to be accelerated. We couldn't wait for the perfect opportunity. We had to create one. It took me 3 months to put everything in place. 3 months of stealing supplies, mapping routes, and waiting for the right combination of circumstances. The plantations. Cotton had been harvested and sold, which meant Hartwell would be making his annual trip to New Orleans to conduct business and socialize with other wealthy planters. He'd be gone for 2 weeks, leaving the plantation in Crawford's hands. Crawford was brutal but predictable. He followed the same routine every day, made the same rounds at the same times, and drank himself to sleep every night by 10 o'clock. If we could get past him, we'd have at least a 12-hour head start before anyone noticed we were gone. The night we chose was perfect. No moon, thick cloud cover, and a steady drizzle that would help hide our tracks. I'd hidden supplies in the woods beyond the cotton fields: food, water, blankets, and a knife I'd stolen from the kitchen. The plan was simple. Meet at midnight by the old oak tree near the creek, then follow the river north toward the Ohio River and freedom. I should have known it was too simple. Crawford was waiting for us when we reached the meeting point, along with 2 other overseers and a pack of hunting dogs. In the flickering light of their torches, I could see the satisfied smile on his face. He'd known about our plan all along. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice thick with whiskey and malice. "Look what we got here. Couple of runaways thinking they can just walk off Colonel Hartwell's property." Rebecca pressed close to my side, trembling but trying to stay brave. I could feel her hand gripping mine, and I squeezed back, trying to give her what comfort I could in what I knew would be our last moments of freedom. "Run," I whispered. "I won't leave you." Run! But there was nowhere to go. The dogs had us surrounded, their eyes glowing in the torchlight, their low growls promising violence if we moved. Crawford stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the alcohol on his breath. "You know what happens to runaway slaves, boy." I knew. Everyone knew. The punishment for attempted escape was severe enough to serve as an example to anyone else who might be tempted to try. "But here's the thing," Crawford continued, pulling a length of rope from his belt. "Colonel Hartwell left specific instructions about what to do if you two tried anything stupid. Seems he's got special plans for both of you." They tied our hands behind our backs and marched us back to the plantation like prisoners of war. But instead of taking us to the punishment post in the center of the slave quarters where public whippings usually took place, they led us to a small building behind the main house that I'd never been inside before. It was Hartwell's private jail, a place where troublesome slaves could be held and disciplined away from the eyes of visiting guests or anyone else who might find the reality of slavery distasteful. The walls were lined with chains and shackles, and the floor was stained with the blood of previous occupants. They chained Rebecca to one wall and me to another, just close enough that we could see each other, but not close enough to touch. Then Crawford sat down in a chair near the door and pulled out a bottle of whiskey. "Colonel Hartwell will be back tomorrow," he said, taking a long drink. "Real interesting to hear about your little adventure. Real interest indeed." We spent that night chained in the dark, listening to Crawford's drunken snoring and trying not to think about what morning would bring. Rebecca was silent, but I could hear her quiet crying in the darkness, and it broke my heart knowing that my attempt to save her had only made things worse. When dawn came, so did Samuel Hartwell. He entered the jail like an avenging angel, his face calm but his eyes burning with cold fury. He'd ridden hard through the night to get back to the plantation, and his expensive clothes were dusty from the road. "Ungrateful" was the first word he spoke, his voice soft and deadly. "After everything I've done for you, Joshua, the education, the privileges, the trust I placed in you, this is how you repay my generosity?" "We just wanted to be free," I said, meeting his gaze despite the fear churning in my stomach. "Free?" Hartwell laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You are free, boy. Free from want, free from uncertainty, free from the burden of making decisions you're not equipped to make. I've given you everything you need, and this is how you show your gratitude." He walked over to Rebecca, who had pressed herself against the wall as if she could somehow disappear into the stone. When he reached out to touch her face, she flinched away, and his expression darkened. "And you, my dear, leading my most trusted slave astray with your feminine wiles. Very disappointing." "Leave her alone," I said. "This was my idea. Punish me, but let her go back to the house." Hartwell turned to me with raised eyebrows, as if surprised by my boldness. "You're in no position to make demands, Joshua. In fact, you're in no position to do anything except accept the consequences of your choices." What happened next would haunt me for the rest of my life. Hartwell had brought a branding iron with him, heated in the coals of a portable brazier. The iron bore his initials, SH, in elegant script that would mark me as his property forever. "Hold him," he commanded Crawford. The burning metal against my shoulder blade was agony beyond description, but I bit my tongue until it bled rather than give Hartwell the satisfaction of hearing me scream. The smell of my own flesh burning filled the jail, and Rebecca's horrified. Sobs echoed off the walls, but the physical pain was nothing compared to what came next. "Rebecca will be sold," Hartwell announced calmly as he set aside the branding iron. "Tomorrow morning. I've already made arrangements with the trader heading west. Should bring a good price from someone who appreciates her. Particular qualities? No." The word tore from my throat like a physical thing. "Please, I'll do anything. I'll never try to escape again." You'll do exactly what you're told, when you're told, for as long as I own you," Hartwell interrupted. "And you'll remember that your sister's fate is the price of your disobedience." That was 23 years ago, and I could still feel the burn of that brand on my shoulder as I sat in the cave watching Samuel Hartwell struggle with his own approaching death. The man who had torn my family apart, who had marked me like livestock, who had sold my sister to satisfy his wounded pride, was now begging me for mercy. The irony wasn't lost on me. But as I looked at his fever-bright eyes and heard his labored breathing, I realized that all the anger in the world wouldn't bring Rebecca back to me. Only Samuel Hartwell could do that. And he was dying. Dawn brought fresh torment to the cave. As the desert sun turned our stone shelter into a furnace, Hartwell's fever had worsened during the night, and he'd begun talking in his sleep, rambling conversations with people from his past, apologies whispered to ghosts, and my sister's name repeated like a prayer. Rebecca. Should have been protected. The children. I'd been awake for hours, watching him struggle with delirium while wrestling with my own impossible choice. Every rational part of my mind screamed to let him die and find Rebecca on my own. But the few clues he'd given me, Thomas Brennan's ranch near Sacramento, 3 mixed-race children, a property sale 2 years ago, weren't enough to locate one woman in the vastness of California. "Water," Hartwell croaked, his eyes opening to focus on mine with surprising clarity. I held the bottle to his lips, watching him drink greedily before pulling it away. We were down to our last few swallows, and the nearest water source was the creek I'd seen yesterday, at least half a mile away across open desert. "How much do you remember about Brennan's ranch?" I asked, settling back against the cave wall. Hartwell struggled to sit up straighter, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounds. "More than you might think. I kept correspondence with Brennan. Over the years, business relationship." "What kind of business?" A shadow crossed his face, and for a moment he looked like the old Colonel Hartwell, calculating and secretive. "The kind that kept Rebecca and her children fed and housed. The kind that ensured they weren't sold to someone worse." I felt my jaw clench. "You profited from selling my sister." "Don't try to make yourself sound noble. I took a percentage, yes. But I also made sure Brennan understood the consequences of mistreating them, made sure he knew I had influential friends who would take a dim view of any excessive brutality." It was vintage Hartwell, presenting cruelty as kindness, control as protection. But something in his tone suggested there was more to the story. "Tell me about the correspondence," I said. Hartwell closed his eyes, gathering strength. "Brennan wrote quarterly reports. Initially about Rebecca's adjustment to her new situation. Later about the children as they were born. The letters became more frequent after his wife died. What did they say? That Rebecca was remarkable, intelligent, resourceful, and fiercely protective of her children. She'd convinced Brennan to allow her to teach them to read and write, insisted they receive proper education. By the time his legitimate son inherited the ranch, she was effectively managing the household finances. Despite my anger, I felt a surge of pride. Rebecca had found a way to survive, even to thrive, in an impossible situation. But I needed more than stories about her resilience. Where exactly was this ranch? About 30 miles northeast of Sacramento, in the foothills. Brennan called it Esperanza, hope, ironic name, considering. I filed the information away, but 30 miles covered a lot of territory. What about the son who inherited? What was his name? Charles Brennan. Weak man, nothing like his father. Thomas built that ranch from nothing, but Charles only saw it as a burden. Last letter I received said he was planning to sell and move back to Boston. When was this? 2 years ago, maybe 3. Time ... Hartwell coughed, bringing up blood. Time gets fuzzy when you're dying. I stood up and walked to the cave entrance, staring out at the shimmering heat waves already rising from the desert floor. 2 or 3 years was a lifetime in the West. Rebecca and her children could be anywhere by now: San Francisco, Oregon Territory, or buried in unmarked graves if they'd met the wrong people on the road. "There's something else," Hartwell said. Softly behind me, I turned back to find him pulling a folded paper from inside his shirt, a movement obviously causing him significant pain. "What is it?" "Letter from Rebecca. The only one she ever sent directly to me." My heart stopped. "She wrote to you?" "Last year. Somehow tracked down my address in Richmond." He held out the paper with a shaking hand. "You should read it." I took the letter like it was made of spun gold, unfolding it carefully to reveal my sister's handwriting. The script was elegant, educated, far different from the crude scratches I remembered from our childhood when she was learning to write by. "Candlelight in the slave quarters. Colonel Hartwell," the letter began, "I write to you not as your former property, but as a free woman with questions that have haunted me for 24 years. My hands trembled as I continued reading. My children ask me about their heritage, about the family they have never known. I have told them their father was a good man who died before they were born, but they are old enough now to see the lie in my eyes. My eldest son, Marcus, will be 18 soon, and he speaks of traveling east to find work in the cities. My daughter, Grace, has the gift of music and dreams of studying in San Francisco. My youngest, Samuel, has his grandfather's hands for working with wood and metal. She had named her son after Hartwell. The realization hit me like a physical blow. They deserve to know their true heritage," the letter continued. "Not the shame and sorrow I have carried, but the pride of knowing they come from people who survived the unthinkable. I have told them about their Uncle Joshua, about his courage and intelligence, about how he tried to save me when we were children. I have painted him as the hero he was, but they need more than stories." I looked up at Hartwell, who was watching my face intently. "She talks about me to her children?" "Every day, according to the rest of the letter." I read on, my vision blurring. "With tears I'd been holding back for decades. I do not expect forgiveness from you, Colonel, nor do I seek it, but I am asking for information. Joshua would be 43 years old now, assuming he survived the war and found his freedom. If you have any knowledge of his whereabouts, if you know whether he lives or has passed on, I beg you to share that information with me. My children's grandfather spoke often of their Uncle Joshua before he died, and Thomas promised to help me find my brother when the war ended. But death claimed him before he could fulfill that promise." My throat was so tight I could barely breathe. She was looking for me, for years from what I gathered. The letter mentions previous attempts to trace you through military records, Friedman's bureau offices, even advertisements in newspapers. Why didn't you respond? Why didn't you tell her where I was?" Hartwell's face crumpled with something that looked like genuine anguish. "Because I didn't know where you were. After the war ended, after Lincoln's proclamation, you simply ... vanished. I assumed you'd gone west like so many others, but the frontier swallows people whole. I had no way to find you." I kept reading, desperately searching for clues about Rebecca's current location. We have left Esperanza Ranch, the letter continued. Charles Brennan proved to be a man of weak character and excessive appetites. When he began directing his attention toward my daughter Grace, I knew we could no longer remain. We departed in the night with what little we could carry, and I pray that our years of faithful service to his family will prevent him from pursuing us as runaway slaves, though I know legally we are free. They ran away, I said, looking up. At Hartwell, she had to take her children and run. That's not the end, he said quietly. I returned to the letter, my hand shaking harder with each word. We have found temporary refuge with a family of freed slaves in Sacramento, but I know this cannot last. The city is no place for children to grow up, and the prejudice here is as strong as it was on the plantations. I have heard stories of Oregon Territory, of communities where mixed families can live in peace, but the journey is dangerous and expensive. The letter concluded with words that broke my heart completely. If you have any news of Joshua, please send word to me care of the At Me Church in Sacramento. Tell him that his sister lives, that she thinks of him every day, and that his namesake nephew has his stubborn streak and quick mind. Tell him that I have never stopped believing he would find his way to freedom, and that when he did, he would remember the little sister who used to braid flowers in his hair when we played in the woods behind the quarters. Tell him that whatever path brought us to this moment, whatever pain we have both endured, the love between us remains unbroken. Tell him that his family is waiting for him in the West, and that we will keep moving until we find a place where we can all be truly free. Together. I folded the letter carefully, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. Rebecca was alive, had been alive and looking for me just 1 year ago. Her children, my niece and nephews, knew my name, knew stories about their uncle who had tried to save their mother a lifetime ago. Did you respond to this letter? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Hartwell shook his head. I was already sick by then. Cancer was eating me alive, and I knew I didn't have long. I kept telling myself I'd write back when I found you, when I could give her real news instead of empty hopes. So you came looking for me instead. I came west to die, Joshua. But when I heard rumors of a black man matching your description, working the gold fields, I thought maybe I could make one thing right before the end. I stared at him, this dying man who had destroyed my family and then spent his final months trying to reunite us. The contradiction was almost too much to process. The IME Church in Sacramento, I said. That's where she was last, as of a year ago. But Sacramento's a big city, and freed slaves. He coughed again, weaker this time. They move around a lot, looking for work, trying to stay ahead of trouble. The implications were staggering. Rebecca and her children could be anywhere in California, Oregon, or even further north. They could have joined a wagon train heading back east, or taken ship to somewhere I'd never think to look. The letter was a year-old ancient history in a region where entire towns appeared and disappeared with the seasons. But it was also hope, real, tangible hope that my sister was alive and searching for me just as desperately as I was searching for her. There's more, Hartwell said, reaching into his shirt again. Brennan sent this with one of his last letters before Charles inherited the ranch. He pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth, handling it like something precious. When he unwrapped it, I saw a wooden carving, a small bird with outstretched wings, no bigger than my palm. Rebecca made this, he said. Brennan mentioned in his letter that she'd taken up wood carving to pass the time, that she was remarkably skilled. He thought I might want to see an example of her work. I took the carving with trembling hands. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Every feather individually carved and polished to a silky smoothness. But it was the inscription on the base that stopped my breath completely. For Joshua, who taught me to fly even when we were caged. Arbucca Brennan. She'd taken his name, as slaves often did when they bore their master's children. But she'd remembered me, Remembered the games we used to play as children when I'd tell her stories about birds flying to freedom, while we sat in the darkness of the slave quarters. She never forgot you, Hartwell said softly. All those years, all that distance, and she never forgot her brother who tried to save her. I clutched the carving to my chest, feeling the weight of 2 decades of grief and loss pressing down on me. My sister was alive. My sister had children who knew my name. My sister had been looking for me while I'd been mourning her as dead, and the only man who could help me find her was dying in a cave in the middle of the Nevada desert. How long do you have? I asked. Hartwell attempted a weak smile. Hours, maybe a day if I'm lucky. The fever's getting worse, and I'm bleeding internally. Even if you could get me to a doctor. What about Brennan's letters? Do you have them with you? Back in my hotel room in Virginia City, along with other documents that might help you track her down. He paused, his breathing becoming more labored. But Virginia City's 3 days' ride from here, and I won't last that long. I felt panic rising in my chest. After coming so close to finding Rebecca, was I going to lose the trail because the one man with the information I needed was beyond saving? Tell me everything you remember, I said urgently. Every detail from those letters, every name, every place mentioned, everything. Hartwell closed his eyes, concentrating. Brennan mentioned friends in Sacramento. Other ranchers, businessmen who knew Rebecca. A banker named Sullivan who handled their accounts. A doctor named Chun who delivered her youngest son. A woman named Patricia Morrison who taught Grace piano lessons. I memorized each name, filing them away like precious stones. These were leads, connections that might help me trace Rebecca's path through California. What about Charles Brennan? Where did he go when he sold the ranch? Boston, I think. Maybe New York. Brennan was vague about it, but he mentioned his son had family back east and wanted to get away from California entirely. More pieces of the puzzle, but still not enough to guarantee I'd find her. I needed something more concrete, something that would point me in the right direction. Joshua, Hartwell said, his voice growing weaker. There's something else you need to know about Rebecca's children. Something that might help you find them. What? The youngest boy, Samuel. He's gifted with metalwork, like I mentioned. But more than that, he makes jewelry. Distinctive pieces that Rebecca described in her letters. Silver work with turquoise. Inlay, very recognizable style. So, if they're anywhere in the territories, if they're trying to make a living, that jewelry would be their most valuable skill. People remember beautiful metalwork, especially pieces made by someone so young. It was a slender thread, but it was something. If Rebecca's son was selling jewelry in towns throughout California or Oregon, someone would remember him. Someone would know where he and his family had gone. Describe the jewelry, I said. Silver bands with intricate patterns. Rebecca wrote that he'd learned the technique from a Paiute woman who worked for Brennan briefly. Traditional designs but executed with remarkable skill for someone so young. I nodded, committing every detail to memory. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Outside the cave, the desert sun had reached its peak, turning the air into shimmering waves of heat. We needed water soon, or Hartwell's fever would kill him before nightfall. But more than that, I needed to make a decision about what came next. I could leave him here and ride hard for Virginia City, hoping to find his hotel room and the letters he'd mentioned. But that would mean abandoning him to die alone, and with him would go any additional information he might remember about Rebecca's whereabouts. Or I could try to keep him alive long enough to reach civilization, risking my own life in the desert. Heat while carrying a man who might die anyway before we made it 10 miles. Joshua, Hartwell whispered, his eyes finding mine in the dim light of the cave. Whatever you decide to do, know this. Finding Rebecca won't be easy. The West is a hard place for a woman alone with mixed-race children. They'll have faced Prejudice, danger, maybe worse. They might not be the same people you remember. What are you saying? I'm saying prepare yourself for the possibility that survival might have changed them. That the Rebecca you find might not be the sister you lost. I looked down at the wooden bird in my hands, running my thumb over the smooth carving. Whatever my sister had become, whatever she'd had to do to protect her children in an unforgiving world, she was still family. She was still the little girl who used to braid flowers in my hair and dream of flying away to freedom. And I was going to find her, even if it killed me. But first, I had to decide what to do about the dying man who held the keys to her location. The choice was mine, and time was running out. The decision came to me not as a moment of clarity, but as a grim acceptance of necessity. Samuel Hartwell was dying, but he was dying slowly enough to make it to civilization if I could keep him alive through the desert crossing. And somewhere in Virginia City, in a hotel room I'd never seen, were documents that might be the difference between finding Rebecca and losing her forever in the vastness of the American West. We're leaving, I announced, standing up and checking my weapons. Now, while there's still enough daylight to make some progress. Hartwell opened his fever-bright eyes. Joshua, I can barely sit up. You'll never get me across this desert alive. Maybe not, but I'll get you farther than if I leave you here to rot. I began gathering what little supplies we had. Besides, you said to yourself you've got maybe a day left. That's long enough to reach the trading post at Devil's Creek if we push hard. Why? The question came out as barely a whisper. After everything I did to you, why risk your life too? Save mine? I looked at him for a long moment. This broken man who had shaped so much of my life through cruelty and control. The honest answer was complicated, a mixture of pragmatism, desperate hope, and something I couldn't quite name that might have been the last remnant of basic human decency. Because you're the only link I have to my sister, I said finally. And because letting you die here won't bring back the 24 years you stole from us. Hartwell nodded slowly, understanding passing between us like a current. We both knew this wasn't forgiveness, it was a transaction. His life for the information that might reunite me with my family. Getting him out of the cave and onto my horse took the better part of an hour. Every movement caused him obvious agony, and twice he passed out completely, forcing me to wait for him to regain consciousness before continuing. By the time I had him secured in the saddle, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the western mountains. I fashioned a crude travois from the Apache weapons and my remaining gear, planning to drag our supplies behind us while leading the horse. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to work. The alternative was abandoning everything and hoping we could make it to Devil's Creek on willpower alone. Talk to me, I said as we began our slow progress across the desert floor. Tell me more about Brennan's ranch. What did it look like? How was it laid out? Why does that matter now? Hartwell asked, swaying dangerously in the saddle despite the ropes holding him in place. Because if I can't find Rebecca in Sacramento, I might need to track down people who knew her at Esperanza. The more details I have, the better chance I have of convincing them to help me. Hartwell was quiet for several minutes, gathering strength. When he spoke, his voice carried the distant quality of someone lost in memory. It was beautiful, in its way. Thomas Brennan had an eye for both function and aesthetics. The main house was built from local stone, 2 stories with a wide veranda that caught the morning sun. Rebecca always loved that veranda. She'd serve breakfast there when the weather was fine, and in the evening she'd sit there with her children while they did their lessons. I tried to picture it, my sister in a place of relative peace, teaching her children to read by the light of oil lamps, protecting them from a world that saw them as neither black nor white, but something in between that threatened everyone. What about the surrounding area? Other ranches, settlements? Scattered. The nearest neighbor was maybe 5 miles away, a German immigrant named Klaus who raised cattle. Good man, according to Brennan. Let Rebecca trade vegetables from her. Garden for milk and fresh meat. Never asked questions about the children's parentage. Never treated them as anything other than neighbors. Another potential lead. If this Klaus was still in the area, he might know what had happened to Rebecca's family after they left Esperanza. Klaus what? Did Brennan ever mention his full name? Hoffman, I think. Klaus Hoffman. Had a wife named Greta and twin boys about the same age as Rebecca's youngest. I filed the information away, building a mental map of people and places that might help me track my sister's movements through California. Every detail could be crucial. The desert was taking its toll on both of us. Despite the approaching evening, the heat was still brutal, and our water was nearly gone. Hartwell was slumping farther forward in the saddle with each passing hour, and I could see fresh blood seeping through his bandages. How much farther to Devil's Creek? I asked. Maybe 10 miles. Maybe 15. His voice was getting weaker. Hard to judge distances out here. Everything looks the same. 10 miles might as well have been 100 at our current pace. The horse was struggling with the double burden of Hartwell's weight and the travois, and I was already feeling the effects of dehydration myself, but we had to keep moving. Stopping now would mean death for both of us. Tell me about Rebecca's children, I said, partly to keep him talking, and partly because I desperately wanted to know more about my nephew and nieces. What were they like? A ghost of a smile crossed Hartwell's cracked lips. Remarkable. All 3 of them. Marcus, the eldest, has your intelligence but Rebecca's diplomatic skills. Could charm information out of anyone, convince them to see things his way without them realizing they'd been persuaded. Sounds dangerous in a young man of mixed race. That's what worried Thomas. Marcus was too smart, too confident. The kind of young man who might forget his place in the world and end up hanging from a tree for speaking to the wrong white woman. The casual way Hartwell spoke of lynching sent a chill down my spine. It was a reminder that for all his apparent humanity, he was still a product of a system that saw people like me as inherently threatening. What about the others? Grace is the artist. Beautiful girl, looks like Rebecca did at that age, but with Thomas's lighter coloring. Could pass for white if she wanted to, which made Thomas nervous for different reasons. He knew what happened to beautiful young women without family protection in frontier towns. I understood his concern. A young woman of ambiguous heritage could find herself prey to men who saw her as exotic entertainment, neither respectable enough to marry nor protected enough to leave alone. And the youngest? Samuel, brilliant with his hands like I mentioned. But more than that, he's got a gift for reading people, understanding their motivations. Even as a child, he could tell when someone was lying or trying to cheat his family. Thomas called him his little sentinel. The pride in Hartwell's voice was unmistakable, and it struck me as odd. This man who had built his wealth on the dehumanization of people like Rebecca was speaking about her children with genuine affection. You cared about them, I observed. Hartwell was quiet for so long I thought he'd lost consciousness again. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible over the sound of wind and shifting sand. I told myself it was just protecting my investment, making sure Brennan treated them well so they'd be productive, valuable. But he paused, struggling with words. But watching them grow up through those letters, hearing about their accomplishments, their dreams, it became something else. What? Pride. The kind of pride a grandfather might feel. The admission hung in the air between us like something toxic. Here was Samuel Hartwell, the man who had sold Rebecca into sexual slavery, claiming emotional connection to the children born of that arrangement. The moral complexity was staggering. How do you live with that? I asked. How do you take pride in children whose existence is proof of your own crimes? You don't, he said simply. You carry it like poison in your blood, and it eats you alive. From the inside. You tell yourself you're protecting them, that your interest in their welfare somehow balances the scales, but you know it's a lie. The sun was setting now, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. In different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. As it was, the approaching darkness filled me with dread. Desert nights were cold, and in Hartwell's condition, exposure could kill him faster than his wounds. "There," he said suddenly, pointing with a shaking hand toward a dark smudge on the horizon. "Smoke." I squinted into the gathering dusk and saw it, a thin column of smoke rising against the purple sky. It could be Devil's Creek trading post, or it could be Apache raiders, or it could be any number of dangers that populated the frontier. But it was our only hope. How far? 2 miles, maybe 3. We pushed on as full darkness fell, guided by the distant glow of firelight. My horse was stumbling now, exhausted from the long day's journey across unforgiving terrain. Hartwell had stopped talking entirely, conserving what little strength he had left for the final push to safety. The trading post at Devil's Creek was exactly what I'd expected, a ramshackle collection of buildings clustered around a spring, catering to prospectors, traders, and anyone else crazy enough to travel through this wasteland. Light spilled from the windows of the main building, and I could hear the sound of voices and rough laughter from inside. "Help!" I called out as we approached. "Wounded man here." The door opened, revealing a bearded giant of a man with suspicious eyes and a shotgun in his hands. "Who's asking?" "Joshua Blackwood. This man needs a doctor." The giant stepped closer, studying us in the flickering light of the torches mounted beside the door. His eyes lingered on my face, then moved to Hartwell's pale, blood-stained form. "Ain't no doctor here," he said. "But my woman's got some skill with wounds. You got money to pay for her trouble?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out the few silver dollars I'd been saving for supplies. "This enough?" The man nodded and called over his shoulder, "Martha, got a customer for you." A middle-aged woman appeared, wiping her hands on a dirty apron. She took one look at Hartwell and shook her head. "That man's more dead than alive," she said. "What happened to him?" "Apache arrows," I said. "Been riding all day to get him here. Well, bring him inside. But I'm telling you now, I ain't no miracle worker. If he's got infection in his blood, ain't much I can do about it." We carried Hartwell into a small back room that served as the trading post's infirmary. Martha examined his wounds with practiced efficiency, cleaning them with whiskey and applying fresh bandages. "He needs laudanum for the pain," she said. "And he needs to stay still for at least a week if he's going to heal properly." "We don't have a week," I said. "Then you don't have a patient. This man moves before his body's ready. He'll be dead before you make it 5 miles. I looked down at Hartwell, who was conscious but barely aware of his surroundings. The fever was consuming him, and even with Martha's care, his chances of survival were slim. "There's a hotel in Virginia City," he whispered, his voice so quiet I had to lean close to hear him. "The Comstock House, room 23. Everything you need is there." "The key?" "Inside my boot." "Left one." I reached down and pulled off his boot, finding a small brass key sewn into the leather. It was warm from his body heat and slick with blood. "What exactly am I looking for?" "Wooden box under the bed. Letters from Brennan, documents about Rebecca's sale, maps of California with ranches marked, everything." I pocketed the key and looked back at Martha. "How much to keep him alive until I get back?" $50, she said without hesitation. "And that's if he lives. If he dies, you still owe me for trying." It was a highway robbery, but I didn't have a choice. I counted out the money, leaving myself with barely enough for supplies and lodging in Virginia City. 3 days, I said. "I'll be back in 3 days." "He'll either be better or buried by then," Martha replied pragmatically. I turned to leave, then stopped. "If he talks in his fever, if he says anything about a woman named Rebecca or children in California, write it down. Could be important." Martha nodded. "I'll do what I can." Outside, I saddled my horse and prepared for another hard ride. Virginia City was a full day's journey from Devil's Creek, and every hour of delay reduced my chances of finding Rebecca. But now I had a destination, a specific room with specific documents that might hold the answers I'd been seeking for over 2 decades. As I rode away from the trading post, I could hear Hartwell's labored breathing through the thin walls. The man who had destroyed my family was fighting for his life in a stranger's care, while I rode through the darkness toward information that might reunite me with my sister. The irony wasn't lost on me. After all these years, Samuel Hartwell and I had become unlikely allies in a desperate race against time. His life and my family's future were now inexorably linked, bound together by old crimes and new hopes. Behind me, the lights of Devil's Creek faded into the darkness. Ahead lay Virginia City and whatever secrets Hartwell had hidden in room 23 of the Comstock House. The next 24 hours would determine whether I found my sister or lost her forever to the vast anonymity of the American frontier. I spurred my horse faster, racing against death and time and the possibility that hope itself might prove to be the cruelest illusion of all. Virginia City burst from the mountainside like a cancerous growth, all wooden buildings and mud streets, crawling with fortune seekers and broken dreams. I reached the town as dawn painted the eastern peaks gold, my horse stumbling with exhaustion after the night-long ride from Devil's Creek. The Comstock lode had drawn thousands of prospectors to these Nevada mountains, creating a boom town that never slept and never showed mercy to the weak or unprepared. The Comstock House stood on C Street, a 3-story hotel that catered to successful miners and visiting businessmen. It was exactly the kind of establishment Samuel Hartwell would choose, respectable enough to maintain his dignity, expensive enough to keep out the riffraff. I tied my horse to the hitching post and approached the front desk, trying to project confidence despite my dust-covered clothes and obvious exhaustion. "I need to collect some belongings from room 23. I told the clerk, a thin man with calculating eyes and pomaded hair. Samuel Hartwell asked me to retrieve them. The clerk looked me up and down with undisguised suspicion. "And you are?" "Joshua Blackwood, Mr. Hartwell's associate." "I'll need to see some identification." Mr. Hartwell left strict instructions about his room. I pulled out the key Hartwell had hidden in his boot, letting it catch the morning light streaming through the hotel's front windows. He gave me this. The clerk examined the key carefully, then consulted a ledger on his desk. "Mr. Hartwell paid for the room through the end of the month. Said someone might come for his things." He paused, studying my face. "Didn't expect it. To be someone like you." The racial undertone was clear, but I'd heard worse. In boom towns like Virginia City, money talked louder than prejudice, and Hartwell's prepaid room fee was enough to buy me access. "Room 23, 3rd floor," the clerk said reluctantly. "Don't take anything that isn't yours." I climbed the narrow stairs, my heart pounding with anticipation and dread. 24 years of wondering about Rebecca's fate had led to this moment. A hotel room in a Nevada mining town, holding documents that might reunite us or confirm my worst fears. The room was spartanly furnished but clean, a single bed, a washstand, a wooden chair, and a small desk beneath the window. Hartwell's few possessions were neatly arranged, expensive clothes hanging in the wardrobe, leather toiletry kit on the washstand, and a stack of books on the nightstand that spoke to his continued intellectual pretensions. I knelt beside the bed and felt underneath until my fingers found the wooden box Hartwell had described. It was larger than I'd expected, perhaps 2 feet long and a foot wide, made of polished cherry wood with brass corners. The lock had been designed to keep out casual thieves, but the key from Hartwell's boot turned easily. Inside, I found a collection of documents that represented 24 years of correspondence, business transactions, and carefully maintained records. The papers were organized with military precision, Rebecca's file separated from other business dealings, each letter dated and annotated in Hartwell's precise handwriting. The first letter I pulled out was from Thomas Brennan, dated just 3 months after Rebecca's sale. Colonel Hartwell, it began, I write to inform you that the girl has adapted well to her new circumstances. She is intelligent and quick to learn, as you indicated, and has already proven invaluable in managing the household. My wife has taken a particular interest in her education and believes she shows remarkable potential. The early letters painted a picture of Rebecca's gradual transformation from terrified slave to trusted household manager. Brennan wrote of her quick mastery of accounting, her skill in managing other servants, and her ability to entertain guests with grace and intelligence that belied her origins. But it was the later letters, written after Mrs. Brennan's death, that revealed the true complexity of Rebecca's situation. The girl Rebecca has proven indispensable since my dear wife's passing. Brennan wrote in a letter dated 1851, she manages the household with efficiency that would shame many white women of breeding, and her companionship has been a comfort during these dark months of mourning. I confess that our relationship has evolved beyond that of master and servant, though I trust your discretion in this matter. I felt my jaw clench as I read Brennan's euphemistic description of what was clearly sexual coercion. Companionship and evolved relationship were polite ways of describing the rape of a woman who had no power to refuse her owner's advances. The birth of Rebecca's first child was announced in Brennan's next letter with disturbing casualness. Rebecca delivered a healthy son yesterday. The boy shows promising features and will, I believe, prove valuable to the ranch as he matures. Rebecca has recovered well from the birthing and has returned to her duties. Valuable to the ranch. Even Rebecca's children were viewed through the lens of economic utility, but as I continued reading, I began to see evidence of Rebecca's remarkable resilience and intelligence. Later letters described how she had gradually assumed control of the ranch's financial records, how she had implemented more efficient systems for managing livestock and crops, and how she had even begun corresponding with other ranchers on Brennan's behalf. I rely on Rebecca's judgment in most business matters. Brennan wrote in 1855, her insights into market conditions and livestock management have proven more valuable than those of many college-educated men. She has become, in effect, my business partner, though of course her legal status remains unchanged. A business partner who could be raped at will and whose children were considered property. The contradiction spoke to the fundamental impossibility of slavery, the simultaneous recognition and denial of human intelligence and dignity. The most revealing documents, however, were the letters Rebecca had sent to Brennan during his occasional trips to San Francisco and Sacramento. These had been returned to him after his death, and Hartwell had somehow acquired them along with the rest of Brennan's papers. Reading my sister's own words, after 24 years, was like hearing her voice from beyond the grave. Her handwriting had matured from the crude letters I remembered into an elegant script that spoke of education and refinement. But beneath the polite formality required by her circumstances, I could detect traces of the spirited girl I had known. Mr. Brennan, one letter began, I trust this finds you well in Sacramento. The ranch continues to operate smoothly in your absence. The spring calving has produced 37 healthy animals, and the new grazing rotation system I proposed has shown excellent results. I have taken the liberty of corresponding with Mr. Harrison regarding the purchase of additional breeding stock, as you authorized. But it was the postscript that broke my heart. The children send their regards. Marcus has learned to read the livestock records and shows great aptitude for mathematics. Grace continues her piano lessons and has composed a small piece she hopes to play for you upon your return. Little Samuel has carved a wooden horse that bears remarkable resemblance to your stallion Thunder. They grow more beautiful and intelligent each day, and I pray daily that their future will hold opportunities their parentage might otherwise deny them. Even in a private letter to the man who owned her, Rebecca couldn't explicitly acknowledge that he was the father of her children. The legal and social fiction had to be maintained even when everyone knew the truth. Found maps among the documents, detailed surveys of California ranches with notations in Hartwell's handwriting. Esperanza Ranch was clearly marked, along with neighboring properties and their owners. Klaus Hoffman's cattle ranch was indicated, as were several other operations that might have employed displaced workers when Esperanza was sold. But the most valuable find was a letter dated just 18 months earlier, not from Brennan, who had died by then, but from a Sacramento lawyer named William Sterling. It was addressed to Hartwell and marked confidential. Colonel Hartwell, the letter read, "As you requested, I have investigated the disposition of the former Brennan property and the fate of the individuals in question. The ranch was indeed sold to a mining consortium from San Francisco who planned to convert the land for hydraulic mining operations. The new owners had no interest in maintaining the existing workforce." My hands trembled as I continued reading. I was able to trace the family you inquired about through church records and employment agencies in Sacramento. The woman Rebecca and her 3 children spent several months in the city, living in a boarding house in the colored section. During this time, the eldest son found work with a metalsmith, the daughter took employment as a seamstress, and the mother provided domestic services to several families. Employment agencies, church records. These were concrete leads I could follow. However, the letter continued, my inquiries indicate that the family departed Sacramento in the spring of last year. Several sources suggest they joined a wagon train heading north to Oregon Territory, though I was unable to confirm this definitively. The metalsmith who employed the son mentioned that the young man had shown exceptional skill and had spoken of establishing his own workshop in a place where his family could live without the constant scrutiny they faced in California, Oregon Territory. It made sense, a place where racial lines were less rigidly drawn, where a family of mixed heritage might find acceptance or at least tolerance. But Oregon was vast, and wagon trains could end up anywhere from Portland to the furthest reaches of the frontier. The letter concluded with information that filled me with both hope and dread. I should note that my investigation attracted the attention of Charles Brennan, who had been attempting to locate the same individuals for his own purposes. When I declined to share my findings with him, he became quite agitated and made several disturbing statements about his rights regarding the family in question. I would advise caution, as Mr. Brennan appears to harbor some form of obsession with these individuals that extends beyond mere financial interest. Charles Brennan was looking for Rebecca and her children. The implications were terrifying. A weak man with money and connections, nursing whatever twisted desires had driven Rebecca to flee his ranch in the first place. If he found them before I did ... I gathered all the relevant documents and maps, stuffing them into a leather satchel I found in Hartwell's wardrobe. The room held other secrets, business correspondence that revealed the scope of Hartwell's financial empire, personal letters that spoke to his growing isolation and illness. But I had what I came for. As I prepared to leave, something caught my eye, a small wooden box on the desk that I had initially overlooked. Inside, I found something that stopped my breath completely. It was a daguerreotype photograph, the image silvery and delicate behind protective glass. The photograph showed a woman and 3 children posed formally in front of what appeared to be a ranch house. The woman was unmistakably Rebecca, older, more refined, but with the same intelligent eyes and graceful bearing I remembered. Beside her stood a young man who could only be Marcus, tall and serious with mixed features that spoke of his complicated heritage. The girl, Grace, was perhaps 14 in the photograph, beautiful in a way that would indeed attract dangerous attention from men like Charles Brennan. And the youngest, Samuel, stood slightly apart from the others, with an expression of quiet intensity that reminded me powerfully of myself at that age. My family, my sister and her children, captured in silver and light, proof that they had lived and thrived despite the circumstances of their bondage. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in Rebecca's elegant script, "For Colonel Hartwell, with gratitude for kindnesses shown. May God bless you in your future endeavors. R. Brennan and family." 1868. Even in expressing gratitude to the man who had sold her into sexual slavery, Rebecca had maintained her dignity and grace. The photograph was dated just 3 years earlier, recent enough that I might still recognize them, might still have a chance of finding them alive and well. I slipped the photograph into my pocket and headed for the door, my mind already racing. Ahead to the next phase of my search. Sacramento first, to follow the trail Sterling had outlined. Then north to Oregon Territory if necessary, tracking wagon trains and following rumors until I found some trace of my sister and her children. But as I reached for the door handle, footsteps in the hallway made me freeze. Someone was approaching the room, moving with the confident stride of someone who belonged in expensive hotels. I heard the jingle of keys and realized with a growing alarm that someone else had access to Hartwell's room. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. I pressed myself against the wall beside the doorframe, my hand moving instinctively to the revolver at my hip. Through the thin wood, I could hear someone trying different keys in the lock, muttering under their breath in frustration. "Damn it," a cultured voice said. Which room did he say it was? The voice was unfamiliar but unmistakably educated, with the slight nasal quality of Eastern money and breeding. Charles Brennan, perhaps, or someone working for him. If Sterling was right about Brennan's obsession with Rebecca, it was entirely possible he had tracked Hartwell to Virginia City seeking the same information. I had just discovered the key finally turned in the lock and the door began to open slowly. I had seconds to decide whether to hide, fight, or try to bluff my way out of the situation. But as the door swung wide and I saw the man framed in the doorway, I realized that my search for Rebecca had just become infinitely more complicated and dangerous. The man was well-dressed, perhaps 40 years old, with the pale complexion of someone who spent his time in offices rather than outdoors. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm and moved with the nervous energy of someone unaccustomed to frontier towns and their casual violence. When he saw me standing in Hartwell's room, his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, recognition, and finally a calculating coldness that reminded me uncomfortably of Samuel Hartwell himself. "You must be Joshua Blackwood," he said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." "Charles Brennan," the man said, extending his hand as if we were meeting at a social gathering rather than standing in a hotel room I'd broken into. "I believe we have mutual interests regarding a certain family." I kept my hand near my weapon, studying his face for signs of immediate threat. Brennan was younger than I'd expected, with soft features that spoke of privilege and comfort. But his eyes held a predatory gleam that made my skin crawl. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said carefully. Brennan smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "Please, Mr. Blackwood, let's not insult each other's intelligence. You're here for the same reason I am, information about Rebecca and her children. The question is whether we can help each other, or whether this has to become unpleasant." "What do you want with them? What's mine by right?" His voice hardened. "My father may have been foolish enough to free them legally, but that doesn't erase certain obligations, debts that need to be settled." The way he said it made my blood run cold. This wasn't about money or property. It was about something far more disturbing. "They don't owe you anything," I said, "don't they?" Brennan pulled a folded document from his portfolio. "Signed contract from 1847. My father agreed to provide housing, food, and education for Rebecca and any children she might bear in exchange. She was to serve the family until such debts were repaid in full, plus interest. The Emancipation Proclamation voided all slave contracts. This wasn't a slave contract. This was a separate agreement, signed after the proclamation, when Rebecca was legally free to enter into binding contracts. His smile widened. My father was very careful about the legalities. I felt my heart sink as I understood the trap Thomas Brennan had constructed. By presenting the continued servitude as a voluntary contract rather than slavery, he'd created a legal framework that could survive emancipation. Rebecca, desperate to protect her children and having no other options, would have signed anything. "Let me see that document." Brennan handed it over with obvious satisfaction. The contract was expertly crafted, full of legal language that transformed slavery into indentured servitude. Rebecca's signature was at the bottom, along with those of two witnesses I didn't recognize. "According to my calculations," Brennan continued, "Rebecca and her children owe the Brennan estate approximately $12,000 in accumulated costs, plus interest. At current rates, that debt will take roughly 15 years to repay. 15 years. Long enough to reclaim Rebecca's children, to force them back into a life of servitude that would last well into their adult years. Long enough for Charles Brennan to satisfy whatever twisted desires had driven his obsession." "This is a fraud," I said, handing back the document. "No court would enforce it, wouldn't they? I have lawyers in San Francisco who specialize in exactly these kinds of cases. The territorial courts are very sympathetic to property rights, especially when the property in question involves unusual circumstances." He was right, and we both knew it. Western courts were notoriously hostile to freed slaves, especially those involved in complex legal arrangements. A family of mixed-race individuals with no resources to fight an expensive legal battle would be easy prey for someone with Brennan's connections and money. "What makes you think I know where they are?" I asked. "Because you're here, going through Samuel Hartwell's papers. Because William Sterling mentioned you specifically when I questioned him about his investigation. And because," he paused, studying my face, "you have the same stubborn expression Rebecca gets when she's trying to protect her children." The casual way he spoke of Rebecca, as if he knew her intimately, sent rage coursing through my veins. "You've seen her recently?" "Oh yes, just 3 months ago, in fact. I tracked them to a settlement called Willow Creek, about 50 miles south of Portland. Charming little place, very isolated. Perfect for a family trying to hide from their legal obligations." My mind raced. 3 months ago meant the trail was still fresh, that Rebecca and her children might still be in the same location. But it also meant Brennan knew exactly where they were while I was fumbling around with year-old letters and second-hand information. "If you know where they are, why do you need me?" Brennan's expression darkened. "Because they've made friends. In Willow Creek, local sheriff seems to think Rebecca's legal troubles are a California problem that doesn't concern Oregon territory. Some of the other settlers have taken a protective interest in the family. It would be much easier if Rebecca came willingly, convinced by someone she trusts. Her brother." "Precisely. You convince them to return to California voluntarily, and I might be willing to negotiate more favorable terms for the debt repayment. Refuse, and I'll simply wait for the territorial government to force their extradition." I studied his face, trying to determine how much of his confidence was real and how much was bluff. "What makes you think the Oregon authorities will cooperate?" "Money, Mr. Blackwood. It's amazing how cooperative people become when properly motivated. I've already made generous donations to several territorial officials, and I have letters of support from influential California judges." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Brennan hadn't just stumbled onto Rebecca's location. He'd been planning this operation for months, maybe years. The legal framework, the political connections, the careful research into their whereabouts, this wasn't obsession. It was calculated predation on an institutional scale. "And if I refuse to help you?" Brennan reached into his coat and pulled out a small pistol, holding it casually but with clear intent. Then you'll have an unfortunate accident here in Virginia City. Mining camps are dangerous places. People disappear all the time. The threat was delivered with such casual indifference that it was somehow more terrifying than screaming rage would have been. This man saw murder as simply another business expense, no different from bribing officials or hiring lawyers. I need time to think about it, I said. Of course. But not too much time. I plan to leave for Oregon Territory tomorrow morning, with or without your cooperation. If you decide to help, meet me at the livery stable at dawn. If not, he shrugged. Well, I'm sure I can convince Rebecca to cooperate once I explain what happened to her beloved brother. Brennan headed for the door, then stopped and turned back. Oh, and Mr. Blackwood, don't think about warning them. I have associates watching the telegraph lines and monitoring the stage routes. Any attempt to contact Willow Creek ahead of my arrival will have very unfortunate consequences for Rebecca's children. After he left, I sat on Hartwell's bed and tried to process the magnitude of the disaster I was facing. Not only had I found Rebecca's location, but I'd also discovered that she was in imminent danger from a man with the resources and connections to destroy her family. The legal contract, fraudulent though it might be, gave Brennan a veneer of legitimacy that would be almost impossible to challenge in frontier courts. I pulled out the daguerreotype of Rebecca and her children, studying their faces in the lamplight. They looked happy in the photograph, or at least content. Rebecca's expression held the quiet dignity I remembered, while the children showed the confidence of young people who believed they had futures worth pursuing. In less than 24 hours, Charles Brennan would be riding north to destroy all of that. I gathered Hartwell's documents and headed back downstairs, my mind already working on the slim possibilities for action. The clerk looked up as I passed, his expression carefully neutral. "Find what you were looking for?" he asked. "More than I wanted to," I replied. The ride back to Devil's Creek took most of the day, and I pushed my horse harder than I should have. But every hour of delay meant Brennan got closer to Oregon Territory, closer to Rebecca and her children. By the time I reached the trading post, both my horse and I were near collapse. Martha met me at the door with grim news. "Your friend's been asking for you. Fever broke this morning, but he's weak as a newborn colt." I found Hartwell conscious but barely able to lift his head. His skin had lost the gray pallor of approaching death, but he looked decades older than when I'd left him. "Joshua," he whispered, "did you find what you needed?" "I found more than I bargained for." I pulled up a chair beside his bed. "Charles, Brennan was at your hotel. He knows where Rebecca is, and he's planning to force her back to California." Hartwell's eyes widened with alarm. "The contract? You knew about it?" "Suspected. Thomas was too smart to let them go without some kind of insurance. He mentioned something about legal protections, but I thought it was just talk." I explained Brennan's plan, watching Hartwell's face grow increasingly troubled as I described the legal framework and political connections that made the scheme possible. "There's more," I said, pulling out the lawyer's letter. Sterling warned that Brennan was already looking for them. "This has been in the works for months." Hartwell closed his eyes, and for a moment I thought he'd lost consciousness again. When he opened them, there was a clarity there I hadn't seen since finding him in the desert. "You have to get to them first," he said. "Brennan has men watching the telegraph lines, and he's leaving tomorrow morning with a head start. Then you leave tonight. Your horse is fresher than his, and you know the country better than some California dandy. My horse is exhausted, and I don't know the route to Oregon Territory." Hartwell struggled to sit up, determination giving him strength his body didn't possess. "Martha, I need paper and pen." The woman appeared with writing materials, clearly puzzled by the urgency in his voice. Hartwell's hands shook as he began writing, but his script was legible despite his weakness. "Map to Willow Creek," he explained as he worked. I studied the Oregon roots when I was planning to invest in timber operations up there. Also writing a letter that might help you with the local authorities. What kind of letter? Confession. Full accounting of what I did to Rebecca, what Thomas Brennan did, and what Charles is planning. Signed statement that should carry weight with any honest judge. I watched him write with growing amazement. After a lifetime of careful self-preservation, Samuel Hartwell was deliberately creating evidence that would destroy his reputation and expose him to criminal prosecution. Why? I asked. He finished writing and signed the document with careful precision. Because I'm dying anyway, and because some debts can't be settled with money. He handed me the papers. The map was detailed and accurate, showing the most direct route from Nevada to the Oregon settlement. The confession was damning, a full accounting of slave sales, sexual coercion, and fraudulent contracts that would make Charles Brennan's legal claims impossible to sustain. This will ruin your legacy, I said. My legacy was ruined the day I bought a 7-year-old boy and his sister. This might be the first honest thing I've done in 50 years. Martha had been listening from the doorway, her expression unreadable. You planning to ride through the night? She asked. If my horse can make it. Your horse can't. But I've got a fresh mount you can buy. $100. It was extortion, but I was in no position to negotiate. I counted out most of my remaining money, leaving myself with barely enough for supplies on the trail. Throw in provisions for a week and you've got a deal, I said. Martha nodded. I'll pack jerky, hardtack, and grain for the horse. You'll need to travel light if you're going to beat that Brennan fellow to Oregon. As she prepared the supplies, I sat with Hartwell, studying the map and trying to memorize the route. It was roughly 300 miles to Willow Creek, most of it through wilderness that would test both horse and rider. There's one more thing, Hartwell said quietly. Something I haven't told you about Rebecca's situation. I looked up from the map, dreading another revelation. The youngest boy, Samuel, he's not Thomas Brennan's son. The words hit me like a physical blow. What are you saying? Rebecca was pregnant when I sold her to Brennan. 3 months along, though neither of us knew it at the time. The child she was carrying, he was yours to protect, Joshua. Your nephew from before the sale. I felt the world tilt sideways as the implications sank in. Samuel, the boy with the gift for metalwork and the stubborn streak, wasn't the product of Rebecca's sexual servitude. He was family in the truest sense, the child of whatever relationship Rebecca had formed in the slave quarters before our failed escape attempt. Who was the father? A field hand named Daniel. Good man, according to the records. Died of fever in the winter after you tried to run. Another life destroyed by the plantation system, another family torn apart by the casual cruelty of slavery. But it also meant that Rebecca's youngest child had different legal status than his siblings. If the contract only applied to children born under Brennan's roof, ... double quotes. Does Charles know? I don't think so. The timing was close enough that everyone assumed Thomas was the father. Rebecca never corrected that assumption. It was a slim legal distinction, but it might be enough to protect at least one of Rebecca's children from Brennan's schemes. More importantly, it meant that part of our original family had survived intact, that the boy with my stubborn streak and quick mind carried the blood of parents who had loved each other freely, however briefly. I have to go, I said, standing up and gathering the documents. Joshua. Hartwell's voice was barely a whisper. When you find her, tell Rebecca. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I know it doesn't balance the scales, but I'm sorry. I looked at this dying man who had shaped so much of my life through cruelty and calculation, who was now spending his last strength trying to make amends for crimes that could never be truly forgiven. I'll tell her, I said. Outside, Martha had the fresh horse saddled and ready, along with provisions for the journey. The animal was young and strong, built for the kind of hard travel that lay ahead. You sure about this? she asked as I mounted. That's rough country between here and Oregon, and you'll be riding it alone. I don't have a choice. We all got choices. Question is whether we can live with the consequences. I spurred the horse into motion, racing against time and the darkness. Bet was already gathering in the eastern mountains. Behind me, Samuel Hartwell fought his final battle with death and conscience. Ahead lay 300 miles of wilderness and the slim hope that I could reach my sister before Charles. Brennan destroyed everything she'd built. The horse's hooves drummed against the hard-packed earth, carrying me north toward a reunion. 24 years in the making, and a confrontation that would determine whether Rebecca's family lived free or died in chains. Time was running out, and I had promises to keep. 3 days of brutal riding brought me to the edge of Willow Creek just as dawn painted the Cascade Mountains gold. My horse was stumbling with exhaustion, and I wasn't much better. The settlement nestled in a valley between towering pines, perhaps 50 buildings, clustered around a main street that spoke of recent prosperity and careful planning. I approached cautiously, scanning for signs of Brennan's men. The town appeared peaceful, with early risers tending to livestock and preparing for another day's work. But something felt wrong. There were too few people visible for a settlement this size, and those I could see moved with the nervous energy of people expecting trouble. The sheriff's office sat at the center of town, a solid log building with barred windows and a brass star nailed to the door. I tied my horse to the hitching post and stepped inside, Hartwell's confession letter folded in my coat pocket. "Sheriff Parker?" I asked the grizzled man behind the desk. "That's me." "You must be Joshua Blackwood." He stood up, studying my face with intelligent eyes. "Rebecca said you might come looking for her family. She's expecting me?" "Been watching the roads for days. Women have an intuition about danger that puts most lawmen to shame." Parker gestured toward a chair. "Sit down. Son, we need to talk." I remained standing, every instinct screaming that time was running out. "Where is she?" "Safe, for now. But we've got problems. 3 men rode into town yesterday, asking questions about Rebecca and her children. Professional men, if you catch my meaning. Bounty hunters. Brennan was already here." "I have information that might help," I said, pulling out Hartwell's letter. "Legal documents proving the contract Charles Brennan is using is fraudulent." Parker read the confession quickly, his expression growing grimmer with each line. "This helps, but it might not be enough. Brennan's got territorial warrants signed by a judge in Salem," claims Rebecca, "and her children are fugitive debtors who violated the terms of a legal contract. The confession proves that the contract was coerced. You know that, and I know that, but proving it in court could take months. Brennan wants to take them back to California today." Through the window, I could see riders approaching down the main street. 5 men on horseback, moving with the confident precision of people accustomed to getting their way. Charles Brennan rode in the center, no longer the nervous city dweller I'd met in Virginia City. Here, surrounded by hired guns and backed by legal documents, he looked like what he truly was, a predator closing in on his prey. "Where's my sister?" I asked urgently. "Boarding house at the end of the street, but Joshua... Parker's voice carried a warning. "Rebecca's not the same woman you remember. 24 years of surviving in this world, of protecting her children from people like Brennan. It changes a person." I was already moving toward the door when it opened, and Rebecca stepped inside. 20-4 years collapsed in an instant. Despite the lines around her eyes and the silver threading through her dark hair, despite the careful way she carried herself and the guarded expression she wore like armor, she was unmistakably my sister. The girl who used to braid flowers in my hair and dream of flying away to freedom had become a woman of strength and dignity that took my breath away. "Joshua," she said, her voice steady but her eyes filling with tears. "I knew you'd come." We stood there for a moment, siblings separated by decades of pain and survival, afraid to believe this reunion was real. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me, and I felt 24 years of grief and longing finally begin to heal. "I thought you were dead," I whispered against her hair. "I thought the same about you, every day for 24 years. She pulled back to study my face, her hands framing my cheeks as if to convince herself I was real. "You look like Papa did. When he was young. Strong and stubborn and ready to fight the world. Rebecca, we don't have much time. Charles Brennan is here, and he's got legal papers." "I know." Her voice hardened. "He's been hunting us for months. Every time we thought we'd found safety, he appeared with more lawyers and more threats." The door opened again, and 3 young people entered. I recognized them immediately from the daguerreotype, though they'd grown in the year since the photograph was taken. Marcus was taller now, with the serious bearing of someone forced to mature too quickly. Grace carried herself with careful dignity, beautiful but alert to danger. And Samuel looked exactly like I had at his age, same stubborn jaw, same intelligent eyes, same expression of barely contained defiance. Seeing him was like looking into a mirror that reflected not just physical features, but the unbroken spirit that no amount of suffering had been able to crush. "Children," Rebecca said, "this is your Uncle Joshua, the one I've told you about." They approached cautiously, studying me with the wariness of young people who'd learned not to trust easily. But there was something else in their expressions. Curiosity, hope, and perhaps recognition of family traits they saw reflected in their own faces. "Are you really my uncle?" Samuel asked, his voice carrying Daniel's memory in its cadence. "I am," I said, kneeling to bring myself to his eye level. "And you're the nephew I never got to meet until now. Mama says you tried to save her when she was young. I tried, I failed, but I'm here now." Outside, I could hear Brennan's voice calling for the sheriff, demanding immediate compliance with his warrants. Parker moved to the window, his hand resting on his gun. "5 armed men," he said quietly. "Professional fighters by the look of them. I've got 2 deputies, both young and inexperienced." "What are our options?" Rebecca asked. "Few and dangerous. We can fight, but innocent people might get hurt. We can try to hide you, but Brennan's not going to give up." Or ... double quote, he paused looking at the confession letter. "We can try to settle this legal-like." "No," Rebecca said firmly. "I won't let my children grow up running. If we have to face this, we face it now." I stood up, my mind racing through possibilities. The confession letter might create enough doubt to delay Brennan's plans, but legal challenges could take years to resolve. Meanwhile, Rebecca's family would live in constant fear of recapture. "There's another way," I said. "Samuel isn't Thomas, Brennan's son. The contract only applies to children born under Brennan's care. At minimum, we can protect him." Rebecca's eyes widened. "How did you?" "Samuel Hartwell told me, right before I left Nevada." "Hartwell's alive?" "Barely. Dying of cancer in a trading post called Devil's Creek, but he's the one who gave me the information I needed to find you. And he wanted me to tell you something." Rebecca waited, her expression carefully neutral. "He said he's sorry. Said he knows it doesn't balance the scales, but he's sorry for what he did to our family." For the first time since I'd arrived, Rebecca's composure cracked. Tears ran down her cheeks as she processed the apology she'd never expected to receive. 24 years, she whispered. 24 years I've hated that man. You had every right to hate him. But he spent his last months trying to make it possible for us to be together again." The sound of boots on the wooden sidewalk interrupted our reunion. Through the window, we could see Brennan approaching the sheriff's office, flanked by armed men who moved with casual menace. "Sheriff Parker," Brennan called out. "I'm here to collect my property according to territorial law." Parker stepped outside, and we could hear the conversation through the thin walls. Mr. Brennan, I've got some new information that complicates your claim. Might want to look at this before you proceed." There was a long pause as Brennan presumably read Hartwell's confession. When he spoke again, his voice carried barely controlled rage. "This proves nothing. A dying man's ravings, probably coerced by the very criminals I'm trying to apprehend. It's a sworn affidavit, signed and witnessed. Creates reasonable doubt about the validity of your contract. I have territorial warrants, Sheriff. Legal documents that supersede any questionable testimony. Now step aside, or I'll add obstruction of justice to the charges against this family." Rebecca moved to the window, studying Brennan with the calculating gaze of someone who'd learned to read dangerous men. "He's not going to give up," she said quietly. "Even if we fight him in court and win, he'll find other ways to hurt us. Then what do you want to do?" She turned to face her children, her expression resolving into something I recognized from our childhood, the same determination she'd shown when facing plantation overseers or cruel masters. Rebecca had always been the brave one, the one willing to stand up regardless of consequences. "We run," she said, "all of us together, north to Canada if necessary. But we don't let them take us back to California." Marcus stepped forward. "Mama, running means giving up everything we've built here. Our friends, our business, our whole life. Our life means nothing if we're not free to live it," Rebecca replied. "Your father understood that. Your uncle understands it. And someday you'll understand it too." Outside, the conversation between Parker and Brennan was growing more heated. It was only a matter of minutes before violence erupted, and when it did, innocent people would be caught in the crossfire. I made a decision that felt both inevitable and impossible. "I'm going out there," I said. "Joshua, no," Rebecca grabbed my arm. "You don't understand what kind of man Brennan is. He'll kill you without hesitation. Maybe, but he wants you and the children more than he wants revenge against me. If I can distract him, give you time to get away. We stay together," Rebecca said firmly. "No more separations, no more lost family." I looked at my sister, this remarkable woman who'd survived 24 years of impossible circumstances through intelligence and courage, who'd raised 3 children to be strong and proud despite the circumstances of their birth. She was right. We'd been apart too long already. "Then we all go out there together," I said. "And we settle this once and for all." Rebecca nodded, gathering her children around her like a shield of love and determination. "Whatever happens next, remember that you are free. You were born free, you've lived free, and you'll die free if necessary. No one can take that from you unless you let them." We opened the door and stepped into the morning sunlight, 4 generations of survival and resistance facing down a man who represented everything we'd fought against. The confrontation that followed would determine not just our family's future, but the meaning of freedom itself in a land still struggling to understand what that word truly meant. Charles Brennan turned to face us, his hand moving to his weapon. Behind him, his hired men shifted nervously, suddenly uncertain about the wisdom of threatening a family that looked ready to fight to the death rather than submit to chains. The moment stretched between us like a taut wire, heavy with 24 years of pain and the promise of either liberation or destruction. Then Rebecca stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never truly been anyone's slave. "Mr. Brennan," she said, "let's finish this. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us."